Of our good life is the vast array of food choices we have.
I was late getting here. I didn't have time to go out for lunch, but I had a sandwich and a cup of coffee sent up to me.
People had some really heartwarming traditions in the 1950s. They'd eat together, spend time with one another, and make each meal a lot more personal. It's not just that. They also ate better, smarter, and a lot more healthier. So for more than just a few reasons, let's go over why it may not be bad to take a page out of the 50s. See, a lot of people make the argument that people from the 90s would live the way we do if they could. I don't think so. Back then, home-cooked meals used to be the norm, and it wasn't just the lack of modern technology, not having convenience foods, and not having Uber Eats that made that possible. It was a genuine choice. People back then were committed to the idea of spending time together as a family. It wasn't just what you had to work with in the kitchen, it was also just the kind of information you had around you. Most people didn't have access to the internet back then, and the most popular way of spreading a recipe around was to get it featured in a fancy cookbook. Most of the recipes you would see in these would all be material that was meant for a family meal. A big meatloaf, a hearty casserole, a stew that can go on for days. It meant that each and every recipe home chefs were learning was something that had to be consumed together. It wasn't just the way they all ate at the same table every single time, but it was also the focus on healthy ingredients. Since people were making everything from scratch, there's a lot less mixed in with your food. No additives, preservatives, and whatnot. It gives you peace of mind, you know? And why would any of this change if you gave them the things we have today? It's not like they didn't have fast food back then. You have to remember getting in trouble if you weren't at the table by a certain time. It was tiny little sentiments like that which really sealed the mindset of eating together as a family into people's heads. Also, one big thing is that a lot of families still had a mindset of not wasting anything, so they would make sure to eat together, focus on the food, and get it finished and wrapped up. The concept of leftovers was something most people tried to avoid. I think it's honestly something we could stand to bring back, because home-cooked meals aren't just ways for families to spend time together, they're also just so much better for you in every way. You see, one of the ways that things have changed a lot is the fact that there's no concept of something not being in season anymore. We have so many methods of preservation, and they're so much better than sealing a couple of fruits in a jar of pickle juice or bringing it or whatever you've heard, that we honestly just have all kinds of fruits and ingredients around the clock now. Naturally, anyone's first reaction to this would be something like, "Wow, the future sounds so nice." I mean, it does sound really advanced. People were used to cycles with their ingredients, you know? You get apples in the summer, you get cranberries in the winter, and you get oranges and strawberries whenever they'd harvest. I mean, the only thing people really had around the clock all throughout the year was corn, but now it's like we have almost every single thing possible. However, that doesn't mean our food is fresh. These ingredients are tampered with to make them last a lot longer than they actually can, and that means we don't really get the full benefit. Plus, now that you can just order a pack of frozen preserved strawberries, why ever get up, get out, and go to the farmer's market with your friends, right? That used to be a pretty fun way to spend the time, and it used to be a pretty good way to make some money too. But thanks to the way everything is catered to and available at the tap of a phone screen, a lot of markets have died down. Don't you think it'd be a hell of a day to go and explore a farmer's market with your friends? Also, since things were seasonal, people would get more in the mood for them. You'd know that apples wouldn't exactly last the entire year, and there was only this brief summer window where you could make all the freshest and best apple pies, so it would put people in the mood to really make the most out of the fruit. It helps to inspire creativity when you know the talk's clicking, not too fast, but not too slow either. So, if you've ever seen any footage from the 1950s of kitchens or restaurants, you'll notice that their portion sizes were a metric ton smaller and leaner than ours. Why was that the case? Well, simply put, since most meals were home-cooked and there was this emphasis on stretching groceries out, there was simply a lot less room to spare for big, size extra-large plates. Plus, most people had the idea that their mealtime would be around a fixed hour whenever mom would make food, or when dad would come home, or when the kids would get off of school. Since almost every kind of meal was scheduled, planned, and eaten together, people didn't really have that much of a thing for snacking culture. Today, it's like you can't get past a day without getting yourself a little sweet treat, and doing that just a couple of days out of the 7 you get in a week means you start dipping into your savings eventually. This wasn't the way people were living in the 50s. They really had no concept of constantly snacking on readily available meals and food throughout the day. Not only that, what they could get from restaurants, stores, and establishments was also sized a lot differently. If you just look at McDonald's, right? Their original hamburger, bun and all, was just around 3.7 ounces, but today's Quarter Pounder is a whopping 4 ounces. By the way, that's just the beef patty. I'm not talking about the toppings, sauce, cheese, buns, or the fact that even the soft drink bottles are bigger now. Yeah, they used to be half the size they are now. Fries also used to be a lot less common than you might believe. Also, desk jobs and tech-based jobs weren't really that much of a thing yet in the 50s. I mean, they were, but you still had plenty of chances to avoid a sedentary lifestyle because most jobs kept you on your feet and active, which meant that most people ate in a way that helped them get through the day. It's just that people didn't have the convenience back then, so they weren't able to look at food as anything but a source of energy and nutrition rather than something to indulge in. I mean, it's obvious why I think this should be brought back, obesity rates aside. Have you seen how many young people are getting heart problems these days? All of this combined meant that people in general had a lot less of a reliance on fast food than they do nowadays. And boy, can I talk about this for hours. So, first of all, let's start with the surface level stuff. Their jobs had them more active, so naturally you might think that they had less of a desire to eat fast food. Not really. People still wanted a McDonald's burger as bad as you did, but they had a lot more reasons not to get one. Firstly, it just wasn't as widespread as it is now. Secondly, it wasn't as ingrained into the culture as it is now. Over the past few decades, fast food restaurants haven't just popped up across the country. They've gotten into everyone's heads. It's like they're the go-to meal for when you're feeling low, for when you want comfort food, for when you want something convenient, for when you need to eat on a budget, because obviously the biggest companies around can afford to cut nice deals. It's like every single eating-related need gets catered by fast food. People weren't eating like that in the 50s. They had different meals, ingredients, and ways of getting different sources of nutrition. Most people really were just too used to eating home-cooked food to constantly go for fast food either, and over-consuming it meant dealing with all the side effects like sluggishness. Plus, one thing that's always been consistent from the 50s to now is that people would rather go home than visit the hospital. So naturally, the idea was to eat in a way that would help you avoid any potential doctor's visits. Fast food has become an everyday convenience in more ways than one. It would be one thing if it was just geographical. You have 100 more outlets for each and every greasy fried chicken franchise now than you did before. It's also the applications. It's all a system, really. You have like 5 different apps whose entire sales pitch is making ordering food at home easier for you. Then you have like 5 different subscription apps that work off of keeping you glued to your seat and couch, and naturally, a pretty good damn way to do that is to allocate your mealtime during the same hours as your break and television time. It just means fast food becomes more than just a meal, but a lifestyle. And it means that you start relying on it for comfort and relaxation rather than a bite of something tasty. That's just now how people were living back then, and I really think that we were better off that way. I know you must be just as aware of the fact that we have a lot of stuff we don't, nor should want floating around in our stuff. It's not any news. I mean, if you were born around the end of the 90s or the start of the 2000s, you already have probably heard more than enough lectures about the cancer-inducing dangers of instant noodles. See, the thing is, as a kid, it really just seems like hyperbole to you. You chalk it up to your parents not knowing what all the new things in the world bring, what they mean, and paranoia. They don't want to risk their darling child getting sick, so naturally they stick to what they know works, and what works for them is home-cooked food. As an adult, though, you start to realize your mom and dad had far more of a point than you ever gave them credit for. Have you ever known exactly what kind of, or how many kinds of things are mixed into the products you see on the shelves? Modern food, especially anything that comes in a packet, is canned, can be called fast food, or processed is jam-packed with preservatives and additives. So let's go over them. First off, we have sodium benzoate. This is something you find in your juices, sodas, and just about most things in a bottle. It helps prevent mold and bacteria growth. Next, you have things like sucralose, saccharin, aspartame, and ACE-K, which are all artificial sweeteners put into anything from your sugar-free yogurt to your gum to that baked croissant you picked up at the bread store down the corner. The flavor enhancers, particularly MSG, are something you can find in just about any snack that we've grown so accustomed to as well. See, the thing is, a quick Google search will show you that a bunch of these have been linked to any number of awful issues like increasing the risk of type 2 diabetes, affecting your gut health, since they mess with the gut microbiome, increasing your risk of cancer, and more. So yeah, I hate to admit it as much as you do, but it looks like Mom was right about the phone and the instant noodles. Yeah, so I know we went over how people ate together and all at the start of this, but I don't think we discussed how much of a ritual it really was. Besides the fact that home-cooked meals reigned supreme, another thing that people committed to horribly was family dinner. Your entire family would schedule the entire day around this, basically. Let's say your mom wakes up at 10 and she has brunch with her friends at 2, or she needs to make grocery runs or stop at the neighbors, and then let's say she needs to help you with your homework. Let's say Dad's favorite ball game comes around 8, right? But Mom comes back from the neighbors around 7, she starts preparing dinner by 7:30 and gets done by 8:30. Dad has to be seated by 8:45, and that homework needs to be done stat. That's pretty much how families lived back then. They would schedule and build their entire day around these meals they'd sit down together for and eat. You know, it might seem really small, but a lot of our traditions really are just that. Christmas dinner, birthday dinners, Thanksgiving dinners, Easter. All of it ends up with spending some time with your family and a good plate of food, and bringing that into the daily stream of activities meant that people got super used to it. They started to think it was the norm, and family dinners became something of a ritual that people had to follow. It helped to make families closer to each other, it kept each member of the family more grounded and involved. Nowadays, it's like your teenagers never really get out of their rooms, and your dad probably has no idea how to make conversation with you either. It's a bit sad, but the simple practice of just spending 30 minutes together, talking, catching up on the day, sharing food and interesting bits of your week lately, it meant a lot. I mean, after all, when we grow up and make friends in the big wide world, isn't that what we do with them too? I can't overestimate just how much healthier food used to be back then too. Before I let the full magnitude of that sink in for a second, let's take a look at how meals are today. So, a typical Lunchables box has a pre-made pizza dough, a few slices of cheese, a pepperoni, and I guess a drink to go with it. A typical fast food meal usually looks like fried chicken, a side of nuggets, fries, or just a drink. Most work culture has become centered around coffee runs and keeping an insane amount of caffeine circulating through your system every day. People's ideas of fruits are really just whatever flavor they're feeling for their vape. Now, I'm not saying this is how all people eat, but it's definitely a sizable portion of the majority. Even most of our home meals are these overly fancy recipes that get clicks on social media, the same pastas we've been having since 2022 now, or just a list of frozen meals after frozen meals. Back then, meals weren't just fresh, they were structured. Have you ever gone on YouTube and watch a fitness bro talk your ear off about meal prep? What they emphasize on is actually something that's pretty relevant in everyday life. You need to be able to build a healthy plate, not simply have the willingness to eat healthy stuff, and that's a skill that not everyone knows, evidently. I mean, I don't either, really. I just freestyle it and hope for the best. No doctor's visits so far, but I'm starting to think maybe eating a fruit or meat so I can steer clear of my visit count, increasing in my 40s and 50s, might not be a bad idea. Males ABC then had a protein, and usually a vegetable like broccoli, spinach, or lettuce, or even another source of protein like pinto or navy beans. Then they'd top it off with a starch, and basically just cover all kinds of food groups with each plate. Of course, this helped a lot because it meant that people were getting a balanced diet. This is a skill that most people in the 90s developed thanks to the stuff they went through in the first half of the 20th century. When items were stretched so thin throughout the wars, rations, depression, and the Dust Bowl, it meant that people had no money to go to the doctors, even less than usual. They had to learn how to eat healthy, because it was often the difference between keeping your budget in check. So it wasn't just the fact that people's lives and environment kept them on healthy diets. It wasn't even really the fact that people just didn't have the massive shopping list of unhealthy items we do today, or the 1,000 downloadable conveniences that make it oh so easy to get those things transported to our doorstep. People were also just making their food in a healthier way, and no, I'm not talking about throwing in a bit more broccoli in there. Today, you might have noticed, the most popular dishes are the ones that are fried. We even have a subgenre for different, healthier kinds of frying now. That's the whole deal behind air fryers, isn't it? And buckets of fried chicken, hot wings, and loaded fries have all made their way into their respective niches, and they refuse to go down either. Long story short, frying is pretty common in America today. Back in the 50s, frying wasn't really all that dominant. Most people were choosing instead to roast their food or steam it, and this had far more health benefits than you may initially be able to name just off of the top of your head. See, when you submerge something in hot oil, you basically give it a 3 times multiplier in terms of caloric and fat content. Pan frying was seen as a lot healthier than the kind of frying that gives you that perfectly crispy golden crust on the exterior, but even that needed a lot of oil. Sure, you could go even more natural, throw in some butter, but even that had saturated and trans fats, and that would lead to heart issues, as I'm sure you've heard many times. Just a fried chicken breast alone has around 400 extra calories simply from the fact that it was made with oil. On the other hand, roasting, typically when there's little added fat, reduces fat intake by a lot. When people roast things, most recipes just require a small brush of oil, and steaming is even better. That uses water vapor, and it basically has no added fat. It gets you the flavors as they naturally are, and it gives you an incredible amount of nutrients without making it more fatty. That's another thing about frying. Nutrients like vitamin C and vitamin B don't do well in super high heat, and they often end up degrading. Frying oil strips away food from its benefits, and the more you reuse oil to save some loose change, the more you do it. Roasting and steaming, on the other hand, do have some level of nutrient loss, but are typically a lot better in this area. There's a reason most people with six-pack abs have steamed fish instead of fried fish and chips. Another way that families really managed to keep things okay and just ideal during the 50s was the way all of their meals were budget-friendly. The idea in this era was to focus on things that were essentially one-pot meals. Slow cooking and big meals like meatloafs, casseroles, roasts, and pot pies were a massive thing. Then, thanks to all the community culture surrounding food, you also had a lot of potlucks going on around, and that meant that the entire neighborhood would bring their best crowd-pleasing knockouts, and usually there would be enough leftovers for everyone. People had learned how to stretch their pantries, resources, and their food in a way that helped to save the budget, and unlike today, back then, eating healthy didn't really have to put a sizable hole in your wallet. That's one thing that I genuinely think would be really hard for us to adapt, because while we can make an effort, it would have to be an extreme one. With the way inflation is, and with the way almost everything is tampered with today one way or the other, it's just not as feasible as it used to be to eat healthy or as easy. Still, families relied on what they could to meet the goal. Like I said, a lot of those casseroles and pot pies were lifesavers. If you notice something about these recipes, you'll notice they're all the kind of thing that requires a filling. This is because the format of a filling is stupidly convenient. You can make a filling out of anything, you can throw in vegetables in there, you can throw in meat bits, and even more carbs and dairy if that's your style of thing. Most meals like this had the entire structure we talked about earlier densely packed into one easy meal that could go around the entire family. It also meant that your mom's work was cut out for her, since instead of making 3 or 2 different dishes, she only had to make one. So, you might have heard rumors or stories about people growing their own food during the First and Second World War. Maybe you passed it off as another bedtime story from his bygone youth. But your grandpa was right, that really did happen. They were called Victory Gardens, and they were arguably the glue that held America together during the Depression and the war period. I'm going to give it to you as straight as possible. Nobody was happy during the Depression. Seriously, it was one thing that the entire stock market crashed and people's money basically became worthless, but it was another thing when the government kept rationing all the good stuff for themselves instead of lending it out to the people. All the good stuff, all the nice cuts of meat, the dairy, the beans. Yes, they had food programs, yes, they did charity drives, but seriously, don't you think that's the bare minimum? People were throwing sawdust in their bread to make it last longer so they didn't have to use flour. It was exactly that kind of climate and that kind of necessity that inspired Victory Gardens. People realized they could not rely on public food supplies anymore, that no one was coming, and if they wanted food on the table, then it wasn't their electives that would help out, but themselves. Let's be real, all those people had all the food they needed to last out the 30s and 40s. The average Joe, on the other hand, had to start a garden in their backyard and grow whatever crops they could. It started when the United States founded the National War Garden Commission in 1917 as a way to encourage Americans to start planting war gardens. And yeah, I know it seems a bit ironic that the first push came from the government, but this was as clear of a statement as they were ever going to give. Presidents like Woodrow Wilson and the First Lady, Edith Wilson, promoted it as every patriotic American's civil duty. Even school children started going into the United States School Garden Army, where they actually grew potatoes in schoolyards. Over 5 million gardens as a whole were planted by 1918, and this helped a hell of a lot in 1942 when the Department of Agriculture once again encouraged people to plant victory gardens wherever they could. Backyards, city parks, rooftops. If it was an empty and unused space, it could host a garden, and no stone, literally, was left unturned. The benefit of living like this is it gives you true organic food and a very intimate knowledge of what you're eating, both things that help you make the perfect diet for yourself. One of the nicer parts of living and eating in the 1950s was that people really knew when to call it quits. Unlike today, where you're pretty much bombarded by a never-ending sugar rush in everything you consume, people ate in moderation back then. The desserts you did have were also interesting little bits of everyone's different cuisines. Today, it's more like a trend that's dominating on social media that you'll start recreating. Remember when everyone was going wild over boba tea? Stuff like that's kind of what I mean. Today, it feels like the effects of such a connected world, the ugly ones, are starting to rear their head. Back then, when the world was beginning to become this connected, it felt like every year was bringing something new. Just 10 years later in the 60s, you'll find out that we made all kinds of new casseroles and desserts. Most desserts were really easy to make, homely, and were fit for an entire family. You had your pies, tarts, and crepes, sure, but you had your soufflés, sundaes, and jams and spreads too, and that was sweet enough. It didn't have to be an immense overstimulating explosion of sugar all packed into one frosty drink topped with whipped cream like you get at Starbucks today. And that goes doubly for snacking culture too. People had drastically different ideas about what it meant to snack and what was even considered a snack. The idea for most people was you would eat 3 good, full and proper meals in the day and have a small snack in between. The snacking was all natural too. You typically just had toasts, jams, Spam, almonds, and packs of dried fruit exactly for this. If none of that was available, most people would just resort to Vienna sausages or cornbread, or go shave some volume off of the leftovers. It was a pretty well-oiled machine, and it meant that people were putting a lot less junk in their body overall. Sure, people snacked, but their snacks were quality and the amount was the perfect quantity, so it was never a problem. Unlike today, where people kind of go rampant with how they snack. You didn't have companies endorsing and encouraging this kind of behavior with how they made their products back then either. Most snacks were much made for an individual, small serving. You didn't get giant boxes of biscuits, whipped cream, cereals, instant noodles, and whatever else we have today. Let's be honest, they say it should last you a month, but it barely ever does, and that's part of the problem. People today snack like crazy, and it honestly keeps us from ever developing our health. Not spending that much on snacks also meant that people were, whether they realized it or not, saving a lot more as they weren't spending that much on food. This is one I've really wanted to talk about, But food in general used to be a lot more different in terms of what it was influenced by. I know this entire video is an advertisement for how damaging the current way our relationship with food is, but a big part of that is how much it's influenced by social media. Have you noticed that we get most of our ideas off of content that's made to get as much attention as possible? In all that, most creators don't even really care about giving proper information in their videos, especially now that YouTube and social media content creation has become a full-time career for a lot of people. I mean, case in point, right? Plus, if you need another example, just look at what happened when TikTok shut down for a day. A lot of people were saying that they had no idea where to get their ideas from now, where to find music, where to find new books, where to find new recipes and food. A lot of our information about the world, what to do, what's in style, what's trendy, what's new, all of it comes from manufactured content that's meant to keep someone's bills paid, and it does that by getting as many eyes as possible on it. That means that your food isn't really about tradition, culture, health, or a good time at all. It's mostly just a gimmick, a trend, something that makes you think you've cracked the code, hacked the matrix. That's how so many of these makeshift diets on the internet got popular. Recipes were something that carried a family's history back then. They weren't something you made for your Tuesday 2 a.m. real calendar. Recipes and food used to be a way of preserving a family's history and tradition, and the entire concept of that, and that whole idea of seeing food as a way to store your own history continues to vanish more and more. I think it's kind of sad, because I think there really was a lot of happiness in finding an old recipe your nonna made and recreating it. Also, you might be thinking that a lot of people may not be able to keep up with managing their food like this. I wouldn't blame you. Really, our world is a lot more fast-paced now than it used to be in the 50s, and most people simply don't have the time or the energy to deal with meal preparation. I mean, really, rent for a two-bed is like $2,000 these days. I'm not going to breathe down your neck if your idea of a fun time on Saturday isn't preparing steaks for the next week. That's how people lived back in the 50s, though, but the trick is, they did it together. Families, including the children, would all pitch in together and help make meals and do meal preparation for the next week. Leftovers would be used or repurposed, and there were entire recipes centered around using nothing but leftovers, like hash. Families would try to spend time together this way too, which obviously contributed to the entire bonding aspect of it. Meal prep was something that not only helped people stick to a healthy diet that they knew worked for them, it was also something that really kept waste low. When you try your best to stick to a routine, you only end up using what you need to recreate it, so you don't actually go wild and burn through your pantry on a half-baked idea you got at 2 a.m. off of a TikTok. Still, that was a different time back then, but I still think it could be brought back in a way that works for the modern era. So, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the way food really roughs entire families and communities together. You've heard it a lot through this video. People sitting down for food together, people bringing food to potlucks, but you may not know how much of an activity community cooking was. It got to the point where companies and cookbook authors would rely on word of mouth helping news travel faster, as neighbors would often gossip and exchange recipes all the time. It was a way to bond with your community, to really know the people living around you, which isn't something we have too much of nowadays. In the Depression alone, it wasn't uncommon for entire community kitchens to regularly make joint meals for an entire neighborhood. Potlucks, church dinners, massive dinner parties, and a lot more were all common ways of getting rid of leftovers, spreading food around, and just bringing the community together. It was less about the benefits, practically, and more about how food was the glue that would keep an entire area of people in each other's lives. Maybe you had no idea how to break the ice with your neighbor, but it was a lot easier to do that over some hot lasagna than it was awkwardly exchanging curious glances from each other's yards. This would obviously go to help you later on in life too. Natural disasters like the Dust Bowl, an economic crisis like the Depression, or the inflation spikes in the 60s and 70s. Caring for one another and being closer thanks to food meant that you were making friends and people you could trust in the area around you. So the next items on the list are actually something made for soup fans. We're going to start with cream of carrot soup, and this cream of line of soups was actually a culinary trend that stretched from the 1940s all the way to the 60s, peaking right in the middle. During the decade we're concerned with, cream of carrot soup was a perfect recipe you could make year-round to warm yourself up and have a hearty soup. By this point, people had become exhausted of most stews and soups, given how much they had consumed in the first half of the century with all the droughts, economic breakdowns, and food shortages. If they were having soup, then the soup itself needed to bring something new to the table. That's when all these cream soups started getting their time in the sunshine, too. It was the first time people were looking for a thicker, gravy-ish kind of experience instead of the usual thin and runny soups. Plus, carrots were something Americans were always familiar with. Carrot pie's been popular in more than a few places, you know? Peanut butter and banana roll-ups are way better than you might think. Despite the seemingly bad impression they make in your head, these are the perfect harmony of savory peanut butter and sweet, sweet banana. Also, it works both ways. If you don't like the texture of bananas because they're very mushy, then you'll enjoy this because more peanut butter actually makes it resemble a custard. If you're already a fan, then you'll find that the sweet richness only makes this much better. So most of the time in the 60s, people used to use flattened tortilla bread for this. Now, some people like to toast theirs, but that kind of goes against the vibe of the dessert in my opinion. How do you feel about it? Also, people were very often using this as a breakfast. It worked too. As far as breakfasts go, this is easily the most ideal one, because it gives you enough energy to last through an entire day. Some people preferred to have this in smoothie form though, but that wasn't nearly as effective as making a sandwich. Think about it. What do you get with maybe 2 sandwiches using the same amount you did for the milkshake? Exactly. And you get milk on the side? Who's ever complained about that? Besides, you know, weird people that don't like milk. Areas. Tater tots were born out of innovation in 1953 by the founders of Ida Golden and Francis Neefy Grigg. Utilizing leftover potato scraps from their French fry production, they created a new snack by chopping these remnants finely, mixing them with flour and seasonings, and forming them into small cylinders before deep frying them to a golden crisp. This process not only provided an efficient solution to food waste, but also produced a snack that was perfectly crispy on the outside while remaining fluffy inside. Tater tots are particularly popular as a side dish, but can also feature in recipes like casseroles, making them a versatile component of school lunches. The method of preparing tater tots involves deep frying, which, while requiring careful temperature control to achieve the perfect crunch without burning, fits well within the capabilities of large kitchen operations in schools. You know, this has been a pretty savory list, hasn't it? Let's change that up. Another thing that was a rising star of the 1950s was the concept of gelatin-based dishes. Out of that trend, we got things like cucumber aspics that were incorporating all kinds of Jell-O flavors into their foundation and recipes. Aspic was a savory gelatin that was made from meat stock, but it was also now coming out in flavors that included vegetables and all kinds of other ingredients. People thought this was an extremely light and refreshing dish. American cuisine is heavy, there's loads of cheese, there's an incredible amount of carbs, there's more protein than you know what to do with, and all of it has been cooked in fat. It takes a toll on you and it puts you in a food coma. On the other hand, dishes like cucumber aspics were cool, light, and would have you feeling like you just went through an intensive 1-week-long detox. The best part was that they looked good and were just as easy to make too, which always meant that they were stealing the eyes of guests at cocktail parties and family get-togethers. People have forgotten all about cucumber aspic now, but when aspic was still making its name, cucumbers were one of its day-one supporters. Creamed corn and bacon on toast was one of the best meals to ever make for yourself. I know we've had a fair amount of toast-based dishes, but there really were so many things you could do. The format is timeless. Now, spreading bacon bits on toast isn't exactly anything we would call revolutionary, but the idea of adding creamed corn onto it as well? Now we're talking. Corn has always had an extremely warm place in most people's hearts because it's just a crop that's always there for you. It's really easy to grow. and almost every farming household or town would have an ample supply of corn. They'd dedicate a chunk of their land to it if they could, because it wasn't just good, nutritious, and free food, it was also good for trading. But you can't do any of that without a good breakfast, and that's also where corn is a great friend to have. Creamed corn with bacon on toast was also something people made sandwiches out of by adding olives, jalapenos, and other toppings to it to make it more exciting and filling. Usually, kids wouldn't really settle for just creamed corn on toast, so it was a lot easier to make a sandwich out of it for them. So today we had shrimp and sushi, and before that we had prawn, and even before that we had catfish and cod. So what came even before that? You'd be surprised, but in the 17th and 18th centuries in America, eels were really common. Early Americans absolutely loved one rendition of eel, which was Old LP, and the fishermen used to keep a sharp and keen eye out for any eel available in lakes. Whether it was local streams or popular fishing spots like Cape Cod, everyone would always gather around a fish market whenever fresh eel was in stock, because everyone wanted to make a fresh batch of eel pies for the family. Despite how tastes change severely throughout the centuries, one thing stays the same. A grandmother always loves creating new food for her children and grandchildren, and a lot of home cooks worked hard to perfect the ultimate old eel recipe that they ended up passing down throughout their families. The taste of old eel pie itself is something that's really hard to describe. It has a texture that's almost similar to apple pie, but it has a really sweet and savory taste working together at the same time. It feels like these flavors are going in opposite directions when you think about them, but in that single pie, all of them manage to sync and create something really unique. Would you ever recreate this dish in your own home, or is it too old-fashioned of a protein for you? Go over to places like Florida and South Carolina, and you'll find enough history on deviled crabs to suit your food curiosity for the next week. Seriously, at some point in the 50s, it felt like this was all people ate. The 1950s were a time when seafood in general was far more on the rise than ever before. There was this big interest in new flavors, new cuisines, and new ingredients, and that had people trying all sorts of things they would otherwise condescendingly say no to. Deviled crab happened to be exactly this, and it was one of the best uses of crab meat I've ever seen. You might be wondering how the common folk were eating it if the star of the show was entirely deviled ham, and I wouldn't blame you for thinking that way. See, back then, salmon wasn't really the only thing that was getting insanely affordable and popular. Fishing was such a common hobby for so many people back then that they actually did manage to fish crabs out most of the time, and that led to people making dishes like this a part of their everyday diet too. Macaroni and cheese loaf emerged as a popular variation in the 1970s when schools sought to diversify their menu offerings while still providing comforting and familiar foods. This dish takes the beloved elements of traditional macaroni and cheese, a mixture of cooked macaroni and creamy cheese sauce, and adds eggs and breadcrumbs to bind the ingredients into a solid loaf that can be easily sliced. The loaf is baked until the exterior is slightly crispy and golden, offering a textural contrast to the soft, cheesy interior. This format not only makes serving more efficient, but also reduces food waste, as the loaf can be cut into precise portions. They don't call this the decade of casseroles for no reason. A vegetable and rice bake was an extremely low-effort, simple and affordable casserole that became very common among working-class families in factory towns. It was also really common in farming communities throughout most of the 1970s and 1940s because it was a very easy way to stretch lots of vegetables and rice into this family-sized portion. It did all that without really cutting into your pantry either. Rice was one of the most affordable grains you could buy, and if you had a paddy field to grow them on, then that was even better. In southern and midwestern households, canned and frozen vegetables were always stocked as much as they could be. They were available throughout the year, most people bought them in bulk, and they were rationed out throughout the months. Now, this could even include little bits of meat if you liked it like that, but most people decided to keep it strictly on the vegetarian side. Why? Well, there's just a lot of meat dishes, especially casseroles already. And besides, With all the vegetables that people were packing into this, it was a nutritional powerhouse. Seriously, this was the kind of thing you'd take for your kids when you wanted them to grow up big and strong and everything. Factory and mill workers were always bringing these in as there were almost always leftovers to go around. So, just like the South was adapting things from the Midwest and Northeast, the other two were. Taking notes out of the South's page as well, particularly when it came to something called Southern succotash, which was apparently a generational classic. Now, succotash originally became a local, regional hit, thanks to Native American influence, and it is believed to have originated from their recipes and cuisines originally. How did this make its way into the homes and on the tables of everyone else? Well, succotash requires a lot of vegetables like lima beans and okra, and what do you know? Take a guess what had a boom right after the Second World War. Really, go for it. Can't? I don't blame you because no one at the time saw it coming either. The agriculture boom in the 1950s was honestly as unexpected as it was appreciated, and people were enjoying more fresh and canned vegetables than ever before. There was also a need for homely and comforting meals that helped you get your spirit back after a long workday, and succotash managed to fit right in that description. Unfortunately, it would lose relevance thanks to eating habits going in the direction of greener, leaner, and healthier. Less fat was preferred, and succotash needed a generous heap of pork fat for its flavor, which really didn't fit in anyone's diet goals for the next few years. Pudding offers a creative solution for utilizing leftover bread in school cafeterias, turning potential waste into a delectable dessert. This dish is typically prepared by cubing stale bread and soaking it in a mixture made from milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla, which infuses it with rich flavors and a soft texture. Often, additions like raisins or cinnamon are mixed in to enhance the taste and appeal of the pudding. Bread pudding is then baked until the top layer caramelizes into a golden crust, contrasting beautifully with the creamy custard-like interior. This dessert is particularly popular in schools due to its economical benefits and the comfort it provides to students. The warm, sweet nature of bread pudding makes it a welcomed treat, encouraging students to partake in school meals while providing them with a source of energy. Lamb pot pie was a savory dish that really stuck to tradition, despite how everything else in the country and this list was actually going the opposite way. Still, even this was a part of the trends of the 1950s. Pot pies, especially one-pot pie meals, had become incredibly popular during the 1950s and were considered extremely good for large families. Lots of families that migrated to stay with their other family members in urban cities also decided to stay there permanently even after things settled down after the war and depression. So there were more mouths to feed on average. Post-war, there was so much innovation in terms of how easy it became to cook. You could do the prep work for pot pies in advance and then get to baking them when you really needed it. It could work with fresh or leftover lamb, which meant that, even just strategically speaking, there was loads of use for it. Despite how this fits right up the alley of most Americans, at its core, this is actually a pretty European dish. Shocker, I know. Lots of settlers and immigrants from the United Kingdom and France had begun setting communities up in 1950s America, and they had definitely brought the flavors of their homeland along with them for everyone. Carrot and raisin salad sandwiches were the prime example of how to make something healthy not taste like death. They were the best thing to have whenever you would visit the countryside, and even people in urban areas started to adopt this recipe. That's because when you see a genuinely good deal, you just don't let it go. And there's rarely a deal as good as this one. Raisins were shelf-stable, sweet, naturally full of sugar, and they could last for weeks if kept properly. Just a bit of Miracle Whip would do wonders for the dish, too. Carrots, on the other hand, were extremely cheap, reasonable to buy in bulk, and for most people in the countryside, a standard crop that they were already growing. They only required some grating and mixing, and it basically was the perfect summer dish because of how refreshing it was. I'm sure the experience of melting in the summer and being forced to deal with the fact that you're an adult human is one we all dread. In times like that, and since it's summer, it's always like that, you want to really spend as little time in the kitchen as possible. A dish like this works even better because you have to spend all of 15 minutes to get it done, and in return, you get a whole haul of goodies. Vitamin A, natural sugar content, fiber, and my mom used to tell me carrots helped improve your memory. So if you're looking to try a new kind of salad, this 60s sensation is probably for you. The next thing we have on our list actually isn't a recipe itself, but a small serving dish that people used for baking all the time. Mushroom ramekins were these oval-shaped ceramic dishes that would come in pairs or single uses, and they were all about the mushroom aesthetic. They had patterns, lids that would resemble popular mushrooms like button mushrooms or earthy colors. Still, you might be wondering what this is doing here, because you didn't sign up for a video on kitchen utensils. Well, these kind of had a cooking purpose too. Mushroom ramekins were some of the best ways to make any mushroom-based dish, and they also really looked good serving them too. Mushroom souffle, baked mushrooms, mushroom gratin, just about anything you can imagine that has mushrooms in it was something that would work with a ramekin. Also, by this point, people had gotten really familiar with the taste of mushrooms and had started adding them to burgers, pizzas, and just about everything else. It helped since they had become so accustomed to foraging for them and eating wild mushrooms during hard times. Something you can always associate with your grandma's cooking is waffles. There was no place in the world that could make a waffle better than your grandma, which is a belief that a lot of kids would fight you over. And I really do mean fight you over. For the kids, the peak of the experience was probably just getting those freshly baked waffles with maple sauce poured all over them. But for grandmas, the best part of the dish was how you could sneak in other things that the kids really needed and didn't eat enough of along with them. For example, one of the most popular combinations was catfish and waffles. Now, I don't really need to give you a rundown on America's relationship with catfish, especially around coastal and rural areas that are near lakes and rivers or anywhere you'd find catfish swimming around. It's one of the most affordable and easy-to-make meals, and you can spin it 100 different ways. Baked catfish, fried catfish, steamed catfish, it just doesn't get old. You take it a bit further and match it up with waffles, which gives them that contrast that cooks are always looking to give to catfish with sauces and spices, but it doesn't really hit the spot like this does. It goes to show that you never really can teach grandmas anything, can you? Now, as for egg and breadcrumb patties, these were really nice protein-packed meals that were also a wonderful way to make sure your family and household wasn't wasting any kind of bread. They were particularly popular in all kinds of farming families, and they were a pillar of Great Depression-era cooking. Stretching ingredients was really essential in these times, and it was pretty much how people lived for ages. This dish was a meat substitute that was great for coal mining towns and towns where industrial, labor-intensive jobs were more common. This is because it was such a good source of protein and energy while also filling you up. It made those really long work hours in the sun or in a mine a bit easier to get through, though let's be real, nothing was helping too much with that. The seasonings were very bare minimum though. Salt, pepper, onions, mustard, garlic were your typical picks. I mean, I know that sounds like a lot, but people would just pick different combinations of these and see what worked best for their pasties. The crunch and crisp on that first bite from the breadcrumbs, though, that was a work of art. As nice as soups are, let's put them to the side for a second and talk about the wondrous glory of curried meatballs. Not sure what I'm talking about? How are they any different from your regular tomato sauce meatballs? Well, let me ask you this, my dear viewer. How often in your life have you come home to spaghetti and meatballs for dinner? Doesn't that same old recipe just get a bit stale after a while? That's exactly the kind of concern people were having back in the 1950s when they so desperately wanted to expand their culinary horizons and tastes just a bit further. People thought there was so much more out there in the world, as well as different and new ways of making dishes that already existed. Curried meatballs were a subcontinental idea that people borrowed, and dare I say, it worked really well. Curried meatballs could be enjoyed traditionally with things like naan as well as in spaghetti and pasta. They were the perfect thing too. One meatball was so filling that lots of people could barely handle a second serving. Plus, thanks to how available ground beef became, it was no sweat getting the resources for more. Bourbon and chicken wings go together like birds and the sky, or like strawberry jam and bread. They've been one of the most definable aspects of American cooking and eating ever since they were first made in New Orleans, Louisiana, which got popular for its bourbon chicken. It used to be a subset of Cajun-themed cooking, but slowly, over time, its roots got diluted and it became more of a nationwide thing that everyone got into. One of the most popular types of bourbon whiskey was cherry bourbon, and one of the best ideas people ever had was mixing that with chicken wings to get a cherry bourbon edition of the best side dish ever known to man. The taste is impeccable. The bourbon enhances every single thing about the chicken wings, while adding a new flavor from the cherry aspect. It kind of gives it this sweet aftertaste that's not really overbearing. You know, some of the best additions and flavors to a tried and tested classic are ones that don't overstay their welcome. They don't overwhelm what you already love about the dish, they just take it a step further with the addition of something new. That's why this dish got so popular at cookouts and pot roasts and was a given if your family was having a pizza night. African American families in particular would love a big combo of chicken wings doused in cherry bourbon, because no party really felt complete without them. You might think I'm over-exaggerating because what can whiskey really do? Well, once you bake these wings to crispy perfection and then add them in a cherry bourbon BBQ sauce, you'll know just how good they are for yourself. Give it a try because it's probably the easiest recipe on this list so far. Mock chicken legs were a working-class classic. It was a dish that was born out of the worst times of the Great Depression, and it was something that particularly shined in Rust Belt cities. It was incredibly popular among immigrant communities. So, there wasn't any actual chicken in this, but using grounded pork or even veal hoe chefs would shape the meat into the form of a drumstick. Pork was significantly cheaper than chicken, especially drumsticks, and since this was made out of round meat and relied on being shaped, even less desirable cuts could work for it. Some even used mixes of veal and pork, and others even went as far as to make their own vegetarian-based versions using mushrooms, mashed potatoes, and other vegetables. They were served alongside similar vegetables to make sure the dish was as hearty as it could be, and it was actually pretty okay for the time. It's not something that you would ever pick over an actual drumstick or something that people think really mimics the flavor too well, but for something that was made out of the most bare-bones ingredients, it was actually pretty okay. Even school children would be eating this, and church and funeral gatherings were often known to serve these as well whenever they could. One of the best things people did is that they also repurposed stale breading with this dish by using it for breadcrumbs. They would fry those in lard, and it would actually be pretty okay DIY fast food. Rutabaga mash is actually another root vegetable that got super popular with the mainstream crowd. Whether it was for its inherent sweetness, the earthy texture, or how similar that first bite felt to a baked potato, rutabaga mash is a forgotten but crucial part of that 1950s flavor profile that we're trying to crack air. People really were scratching their heads when it came to what to do with vegetables. I mean, sure, they picked up loads of new tricks in the past 2 decades with them, but those decades also involved violently abusing and spamming those tricks to the point where most people could go 3 or 4 decades without ever seeing them again. Post-war era comfort food was a weird place where most people were burnt out on the typical ingredients that were now available again, and as a result, kept looking for new things. Rutabaga came as a clutch savior in that time period because it was basically what everyone wanted. The health-conscious crowd found it to be exactly what they were looking for, thanks to the dump truck of vitamins you got out of this. The comfort food enjoyers swore by it because of how nice the mash was and how well it worked with savory main courses. People who wanted new things and vegetables also liked it because, well, it was new. It's funny how much that can do for a dish, or anything, really. The people who didn't have a lot to spend on food adventures liked it too because it was inexpensive. Really, just all around a crowd pleaser. This festive dish, emerging in American culinary circles in the mid-20th century, cleverly combines the contrasting flavors of sweet pineapple and savory cheese. The pineapple cheese ball consists of cream cheese enriched with finely chopped pineapple, green peppers, and sometimes added ham or pecans, rolled into a ball and coated with crushed nuts. The dish captures the post-war American enthusiasm for novel flavor combinations and party foods that could double as conversation starters. Its popularity at social events can be attributed to both its taste and its decorative appearance, which made it a visually appealing centerpiece on buffet tables. The pineapple cheese ball also illustrates the period's innovation in using canned ingredients, which were celebrated for their convenience and year-round availability, allowing hosts to whip up impressive treats without extensive preparation. Cucumber and onion sandwiches were a really simple and refreshing butter, mayonnaise, different kinds of spices, and sometimes bits of bacon and ham on top of cucumbers. See, now I don't know if you guys will agree with me, but cucumbers really have a good place in the world of sandwiches and burgers. They're one of the most light toppings you can add, they're abundant, they're good for you, that crunchy bite is immaculate, and they work well with most kinds of sauces. It's a really straightforward dish that can work with almost anything you happen to have on hand. And on a hot summer day, this was the perfect meal to eat for your work lunch. It was served as an interlude between the usual fried, oily, and greasy food most Americans were used to anyway. Onions were something that everyone always had, and this could work with fresh or stale bread. They were beloved mostly for their detoxifying effects and how refreshing a cucumber can be. Textile workers and coal miners in particular loved these because it would take the edge off. Cream of carrot? Try cream of peanut soup. Seriously, you might be surprised at the things you'll find on this list because people were eating all kinds of things you would never think they'd pick out for themselves nowadays. Peanuts were so available during the 20th century and were often a classic snack for people from all places of the country to enjoy throughout the day. Like other soups, this was a soup that gained fame for how comforting and warm it was. People fell for the velvety textures, the thick consistency, and the visual appeal. Cream of peanut soup looked like if you turned a hug into food, and that's honestly the best way I can describe it. Plus, people were adding things like dried fruits and herbs to it to make it bang even more. I think it worked, to be honest. Most of these recipes seem like veritable treasure troves of flavor, and all these soups are definitely something I'm going to be trying out this winter. What about you? We've just hit January, but it's still cold enough to expand your soup arsenal and add a few new, tried and tested ones. Macaroni and tomato soup bakes were an easy-to-handle casserole that was extremely hot in the working-class communities throughout the middle half of the 20th century. This was a dish that took elbow macaroni with canned tomato soup, and it was almost always Campbell's. A few more pantry staple ingredients would ensure an inexpensive and wonderful meal that maybe the kids would take a few rounds getting used to. For the adults, though, it was the best way to have comfort food on a budget besides potatoes. All you needed was cheese, milk, and eggs if they were available, but even without these, the dish could still be made. It just would not be as thick, rich, or as flavorful. The best part about this was that all you had to actually do was just boil the pasta and you would be set for the entire day. This could include bits of ground beef, bacon, or ham, whatever kind of protein is your choice really. But it could also be made creamy and with just aromatics and herbs. There was a lot of versatility with this bake, and that's because it was so simple. It made for a very flexible dish that could fit a lot of people's preferences easily, with almost none of the fuss you normally associate with homemade pasta dishes. This is so easy, even your teenagers could pick it up, really. Rice pudding is a classic dessert that finds its way into school menus, beloved for its simplicity and comforting qualities. Made by slowly simmering rice in milk until the grains are tender, this pudding is sweetened with sugar and typically flavored with vanilla, cinnamon, or even a bit of citrus zest to elevate the dish's aroma and taste. The slow cooking process allows the rice to absorb the flavors and the milk to thicken into a rich, creamy texture. Rice pudding can be served either warm or chilled, making it a versatile option for different seasons and preferences. Its gentle, creamy texture and the mild, sweet flavor profile make it an excellent choice for a school dessert, offering a source of carbohydrate and calcium. Indulge in the European-inspired rice pudding lunch bowl, where tradition serves comfort at your American lunch. Made from a simple mix of cooked rice, milk, sugar, and a hint of vanilla, This dish is cooked slowly until it becomes thick and creamy. The rice pudding lunch bowl could be customized with various toppings, such as a dusting of cinnamon, a dollop of jam, or fresh berries, providing versatility and appealing to different tastes. Once prepared, it's often garnished with a sprinkle of cinnamon, fresh fruit, or nuts, adding flavor and texture. Served either warm or cold, it was adaptable as a dessert or a light lunch, fitting seamlessly into any meal plan. Its versatility was appreciated in homes where cooks valued recipes that could be easily adjusted to suit the occasion, making rice pudding a reliable and satisfying choice. And that brings my recollection of how people ate in the 1950s to an end. Do you think we should bring these traditions back? Comment down below if you do, and don't forget to like and subscribe.